addresses. So
Okay. All right. We are live. Usually I can see a bunch of people show up, but nobody's here. So I'm going to call to order our special board workshop of Wednesday, March 17th. Can we get a roll call?
student trustee Corso Clark. It's going to be late. Student trustee Mala.
Here.
Trustee Boyd.
Here.
Trustee Davidson. Trustee Davidson.
Here.
Trustee Duran. Not yet. Vice President Doss. Not yet. And President Hinckley.
Here.
Superintendent Wells.
Here.
Thank you.
Do you mind putting up the mission and vision statement, and maybe we can take turns reading it since Audrey's probably tired of doing it and Leo's not here.
Yep, there you go.
I can read the mission, and then maybe Melissa and Bonnie can do the norms. The mission of Albany Unified School District is to provide excellent public education that empowers all to achieve their fullest potential as productive citizens. AUSD is committed to creating comprehensive learning opportunities in a safe, supportive, and collaborative environment, addressing the individual needs of each student.
Okay, I'll read the first two meeting norms. 1, maintain a focus on what is best for our students. 2, ensure a safe environment for all views to be expressed, treating each other, staff, and the public respectfully.
3, endeavor to find common solutions to issues through collaboration without sacrificing one's beliefs in what is best for students. 4, make a commitment to effective deliberation, each one listening with an open mind, while others are allowed to express their points of view, even if one disagrees.
Great, thank you. And now we need to approve our agenda. And we do have 3
Motion
of us,
that we
or 4. Go ahead. I'll second. Can we get a roll call?
I'm sorry, I missed the motion. I didn't hear it. Who was that?
It was me, Trustee Davidson. I motion that we approve the agenda.
Thank you. And it was seconded by President Hinckley.
Mhm.
Thank you. Okay. Student trustee Mala,
Yes.
trustee Boyd,
Yes.
trustee Davidson,
Sorry, I'm joining on my other one. Yes.
thank you. Vice President Doss. I see he's here.
Here. I'm here.
Thank you. We're voting on the approval of the agenda. Vice President Doss.
Yes.
Sorry, we're doing the approval of the agenda. I'm just calling on you for your vote.
Oh, yes.
Thank you. President Hinckley
Yes.
and trustee Duran.
Yes, and I apologize to everybody for being late.
Thank you.
Great. Our agenda passes unanimously, and I will now welcome and turn it over to Nicole or Dr. Wells. I don't know if you want to.
I accept it and pass it over to Nicole. It's been a while since Nicole's been with us. Nicole is our facilitator and trainer for equity. She's worked with hundreds of school districts in great demand, and she carved out some time to come with us. We have a series of equity workshop plan, and we thought way back when, in order to really be grounded in equity and not just have it as rhetoric, that we set adequate time apart aside rather, to discuss what the definition of equity is. How do we engage in equity in just about everything we do, and to have time set aside to hopefully at the end, at one of our sessions, to look at and consider some equity policies that can continue to guide our work. For those of you who don't know Nicole Anderson, and those of you who are about to get familiar with her, she is an exceptional facilitator and trainer up and down the coast here in California and abroad. And so with no further ado, I introduce to you our very own, and I call her our own, Nicole Anderson.
I feel the love. I appreciate that. Thank you for the introduction, and always honored to be accepted into someone's community. I don't take that lightly. So thank you for having me tonight. I know you all are exhausted. I can see it in your eyes, and I know it's hard, but I just want to commend you tonight for carving out what I call sacred time to learn together, to collaborate. We don't have business tonight, right? We just have learning together. And so I always want to just acknowledge the value of this time as a governance team. To be effective, you definitely have to learn together. And so we're going to learn, we're going to talk. This is your study session. So I always want to acknowledge, the staff in particular who joined, and also I'm sure are exhausted. The executive cabinet, they are a huge part of the work, obviously, and are an extension of your superintendent. But tonight is really more about you as a governance team. And so I will a lot of times be referring to you as a team. Obviously, Audrey's here in her capacity as student voice, which I want to also commend and acknowledge the inclusion of student voice in the decision-making process, which every board doesn't do. So just really acknowledge and admire that. And just look forward tonight to just walking you through some things, doing a little bit of recap, right? You've slept since May. I think it was May we were together, right? It's been a minute. And we've had a lot go on, right? You had like 2 pandemics come right in your face, right? You got COVID-19, you got racism. It's like, wow, since I saw you last. And then you got 2 amazing new board member colleagues, Melissa and Veronica. So again, great to meet both of you. And so there's a lot that's been going on since I saw you last. So I hope you're still excited about equity. I hope you're still on fire. You're still encouraged, all that good stuff. But also I want to acknowledge how hard this work is, and to your community who may watch, from a distance through the video, who may kind of watch the process. I want to just acknowledge how hard this has been as a governance team with just the concept of reopening schools. It's been hard. It's a lot of pressure, a lot of just kind of inequities that have come out of this. And so tonight we're going to really focus on how do we really continue to build our capacity as an effective team through our equity lens. Okay, so we're going to do that tonight. And again, at any point, jump in, interrupt, because this is your professional learning space. Okay, sound like a plan? All right, well, I'm going to jump right in. At any point, if you need to stretch, anything of that nature, feel free. Let's see what's going on. All right, I'm just going to go ahead here. All right, there we go. All right, so hopefully y'all can see the screen. So what we're going to talk about tonight again is that concept of effective governance with our equity lens. Keyword is our. So as we're doing this work, we're going to continue to develop our lens as a team. And one of the things that I want to just kind of set the tone for tonight is, even in the midst of all that's going on, I hope that you're excited like me about the fact that you have one of the most important jobs on the planet, which is to educate kids. And I'm always reminded in the last kind of 3 weeks specifically about, even in the midst of all that's gone on, we have the opportunity to educate kids. And Frederick Douglass reminds us of why this job is so important, right? I love the connection. It sure is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men, women, people, right? Very much easier. And I say that because in the midst of all that's going on, most of the challenges that you've had have been dealing with adults. Would you agree? Right? The kids have always been amazing, right? The kids, it's like, kids not the issue, right? COVID came and the adults lost our minds. Like, we just lost it. And this is unprecedented, right? Rightfully so. But I want us to remember that the work we do in regards to affecting the society that has been so challenging for us now, it really starts in the space where kids are moldable, where we can give them the tools, we can give them the access to be able to impact their world in a very different way. So I call this, in so many words, interrupting some of the generational oppression that we pass on, right? The generational inequities we pass on, we can really make a difference through our children. So I hope you're excited about that and understand the purpose of education is not just about passing policy, making decisions, but it's with a bigger vision of us educating kids, strong kids who come out into this world as grown-ups with the tools that they need to make much better decisions than us adults, right? And I call us adults out. Like, we have been getting it wrong. We have been getting it wrong in front of our kids. And this is all across society. So we have to see the role of education in interrupting some of the things we see. And I hope you agree. And that's, again, that's my encouragement right now. Now, I want to remind us as we engage in our work today, remember our 4 agreements. Okay, these has been a minute, but our 4 agreements, I show it to your leadership team. I show it to everybody I work with. Is in order to do this work, we want to make sure we have a safe space to engage in this. And this is very important across our community, that there's a safe space for everybody to join, no matter where they're on their journey. And that safe space is where people can speak their truth. They can share their perspective. They're not attacked or judged based on their perspective. They don't feel inadequate to join this space. But surely it's a space where people have to understand, like, it's going to be a little uncomfortable. And discomfort is where we grow, which creates brave space, right? The space where we create actions that interrupt inequities. And so safety is important, but also wrestle with discomfort may happen, right? Has to happen. We can't grow without it. So with our 4 agreements, I just want to check in with you, make sure we're still good with these, because you all agreed to them, believe it or not, way back when. I know Melissa and Veronica, you're like, okay, these are new for us, but this is part of what supports some of your working norms as well, right? Like when we do uncomfortable work together, these are also great things to think about. How do we stay engaged when it gets uncomfortable? How do we be okay with discomfort? How do we honor everybody's truth, even though our truths may not be the same? And I want to make connection to your governance team, right? As a 5-member board, obviously you have your superintendent, you have your student reps, but as a 5-member board, you got to remember, you all come with individual truths. And then the reality is, though, when you swing that gavel, right, and the meeting opens, what happens? We become one. So our truth, our speaking our truth eventually becomes one versus 5 individual truths. And that's going to be something we work on, right, moving forward. Like, how do we speak our truth individually, but also think about what that looks like as a collective team? Last but not least, non-closure. I know some of you, I know your personalities a little bit, and y'all like, we got to get it done. Tell us what to do, Nicole. Let's check those boxes. Let's get this done. Let's close these gaps like ASAP, right? And the reality is, this type of work is a journey. It takes time. It's a go slow to go fast process. And so you have to expect there's going to be some non-closure, and you got to accept it, right? It's going to take time, because you're talking about moving a system that's hundreds of years old, and you're also talking about moving people in the system, which takes time. So I want to just check in and make sure that our 4 agreements are still good. I want to make sure our 2 new board members got a chance to see kind of the context of how I share these. I'm going to use these again in each of our board study sessions moving forward, but just want to make sure we're good with our 4 agreements. Sound all right? All right. So I'm going to push y'all a little bit to just engage in these and help us to grow together tonight. All righty. So a couple of things that's important. I want to just remind us about the importance of centering our work tonight. So one of the reasons why we come together in our study session time, especially around the concept of equity, is that we have to ensure that we go back to, like, what is our purpose? What is our why? When doing equity work, and you all have been engaged in this for a little while, remember, there's a lot of struggles in this work. There's a lot of challenges. And so sometimes when that pushback and that discomfort comes, when the storms come, like COVID-19, racism, and any other form of oppression that just constantly is causing this real discomfort, always got to go back to our why. So just recentering the work is really important. And I just admire what you all do. Each of your board meetings is reading through your norms, reading your mission. That is a recentering of our work to remind us of why we're here, because the why is going to be the core of everything you do. And when we talk to in our sessions, we're going to talk about your equity statement, right? And developing a statement, evolving a statement to get to a place of understanding that this is our why. So we're going to work on that, because everything we do on the outside of our why, just like Simon Sinek Circle, the how we do it as a board is going to be very important. It's going to be centered around the how of our equity work. So the how shows up in your norms, right? How you interact with each other, how you work together, your protocols, which show up in your handbook, the one I know y'all read all the time, right? Yeah, everybody's like, yes, I do all the time, right? But again, your protocols, all the stuff that shows up in your handbook that guides how we work together, your roles, right? What are the practices of the board? That's the how of the work. Very important too. But then most critically is now the what of the work, right? Like, what is the outcome? What is it we're going to see? And so not only is it closing student achievement gaps, right? It's addressing all kinds of forms of inequity. And that's where Dr. Wells talked about your equity policy. That is going to be the what of your work. We're going to have to develop a policy that guides our work because our governance team operates at the policy level. So that's going to be the what of the work, one of the outcomes. And of course, I'm going to talk to you about prioritizing the work. Okay, there's a lot you all do, right? There's a lot you do. You probably can't even keep up after you're just like, I don't even remember what we did last night. It was so much, right? And then the night before and the week before, there's a lot that goes across the desk of governance teams. So we got to think about how do we prioritize our work so we can stay laser focused on equity, because there's a lot that will distract us from the work. And we're going to talk about our roles and how our roles really have to be centered around our priorities. Okay, so that's, you see kind of where we're going. Like everything about what we do is going to be centered in our why, which is your equity work, right? It's your equity statement, it's your purpose, your vision. But then you're going to get to a space of now thinking about how we're going to get the work done. And so I always encourage boards to just recenter, take a moment, recenter whenever you're having moments of conflict. Anytime you're just kind of confused, not sure, it's okay to just recenter. Why are we here? Okay, make sense? All right. All right. So I'm going to get you fired up this morning, Dr. Wells. I thought, no, or this afternoon, this evening, whatever time it is, it's after 7. It's not morning or afternoon. However, I've been up since 7, so that's probably why. However, I want to fire you up a little bit and get us started with a little warm-up activity. And I call this just a conversation about the governor's reopening plan. So I know you all are familiar with the plan. I know you've kind of been, you've seen recently, this is just what, 2 weeks old, and there's a little bit of an incentive built into that plan, right? I call it dangling dollars to districts to reopen, right, by April 1st, right? Very interesting concept. As I talked to lots of board members and lots of like leaders of school districts about, well, is this plan equitable? Is this plan equitable? And so I'm not going to go too deep into the details of it, but I think you all are familiar with it, correct? We're all familiar, right? Okay, so this is the plan that came from the state, okay, incentivizing schools to open by the 1st. Okay, now I know every district's in different places, so I'm not going to get into that yet, but I want to ask you the question, is his plan equitable? So I'm just going to pause and anybody can jump in and just share your thoughts. Is it equitable? What do you think? What do you think? Is it equitable? All right, I'm gonna start picking on folks. I know y'all tired, so that's what I'm gonna pick on you. So I'm gonna start off. Yeah,
No, it's
huh?
not. No, it's not equitable.
It's not equitable. All right, tell me more.
Well, when you look at the data around the state, what schools are opening up and which ones are meeting that target, it, generally speaking, it's schools that are well off or in wealthier communities. The schools that are not opening are schools that are in great need of resources. So it's almost giving the money to those who don't need it while leaving out those who need it.
Yeah. Well said. Yeah. Well said. Anyone else want to jump in and add to Dr. Wells' comment or add another perspective?
I only jumped in because I didn't want to pick on anyone.
Because you know I was on my way, right?
I'll
Go
jump
ahead,
in.
Clementina.
I'll jump in. And this is just by looking at the title, right? It talks about reopening the schools for the K-2, and then lower on it says partial reopening of middle and high schools.
Right.
So I see and inequality, and then it raises the question of equity of the kids that are going back. And certainly we know middle and high school students, there are many needy students there as well. So to kind of focus on the K-2 with and then a partial for the rest of the kids raises a whole lot of questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well said. Well said. Y'all are on to something. So I'm hearing you, I think I hear you say, Trustee Doron, that it is not equitable. Would you agree with Dr. Wells? Not equitable. All right. All right. Veronica, why don't you jump in? Hi, Leo. Good to see you.
Okay. Can you guys hear me okay today?
Can hear
Yes.
you all right.
We
Yep.
good?
Yep.
Yay, my iPad's working on the internet tonight. You know, to me, the word that is really challenging is setting the deadline to reopen schools. And instead of offering support in that or helping with steps to do that successfully that everybody could follow and really giving a framework for that, you guys know I'm all about that process. He just sets a deadline and says there's money at the end. Well, that's going to be the people who already have the steps in place reach that deadline. And the districts that maybe couldn't start because they were dealing with so many other issues of getting food to kids, of getting devices to kids, they're not going to meet that deadline because it doesn't work. And some of our bigger districts who have so many more stakeholders involved maybe can't meet that deadline.
Yeah, well said. Thank you. Appreciate that, Trustee Davidson. Powerful.
I think it also,
Yeah, jump in, please.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, I think it, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Vice President Dossett here. Okay. I think it highlights a issue that we've seen around like legislative bodies and in this case politicians making political decisions under pressure. And obviously we've all seen like the pressure Newsom is currently under for his position. And it just seemed like this was a very rushed process. And as we're identifying the kind of holes in this plan, I think that's one thing that I was definitely thinking about of you know, making political decisions.
Yeah. Yeah, well said. Well said. Pressure. So political pressure. So Audrey, would you say that this is not equitable either? Would you agree?
Yes, I would agree.
Okay. All right. All right. Let's see. Vice President Doss, jump in.
I mean, I would say that it's not equitable. My reasoning would be that I think that the money is being thrown to motivate the wrong things. You know, maybe if it would have said 2 billion in incentives towards, and then have, you know, towards like specific things like these students that are in need, or these students, or you know, enhancing the food program for the food loss of kids, you know, about not being in school, or it doesn't really address the specific needs, I think, you know, around schools being closed and needing to reopen. So maybe if it would have been more specific around that, it would have gotten to the students that need it.
Got it. Yeah, good point. So kind of similar, I think, what Veronica said, right? Like not having a framework, right? Not having real, like, what do you do? Any guidance? Leo, jump in.
Yeah, I agree with Trustee Dawson, Trustee Davidson about sort of how there's not a lot of real structure to where the money is going. It's just sort of an incentive. Districts wouldn't necessarily even need to use that money to facilitate the reopening process based on what we know from this headline. And also just knowing sort of schools in California, there are over half of our school districts in the state, I believe, are solely elementary school districts. And so there are all those school districts who would have to comply to this deadline, but wouldn't even have sort of the option or wouldn't even be eligible to receive the incentives and that money just because they don't have middle and high schools to reopen. I think that therefore it would be inequitable just because the money, in addition to it being cut off to more affluent districts that are already more likely to be able to reopen sufficiently and more place to do so. There are many schools and many students that would not stand to benefit from the money given the current.
Good point. Anyone else want to jump in and add? Because I'm hearing kind of unanimously so far that it is not equitable. I'm hearing certain communities can open sooner than others, just one because of just where they're located. There's different tiers, as we know, in our state. Some communities have been harder hit from COVID and don't necessarily have the ability to open up even if they wanted to. Again, it lacks guidance, right? I think I heard Audrey, you say there's a political pressure here. So even like the motivation of this, like, is it really well thought out to really address the needs of kids? I mean, I don't think any of us would disagree, like more funding to schools is not a bad idea, right? We always know we've been inadequately funded, but throwing money at a problem without really addressing it specifically is also still not going to fix it either, right? Jump in, Veronica, please. Was that on accident? Oh, there, yeah, jump on in. I think Veronica's frozen. Are you frozen?
I also was thinking, no, it's intentional. I was thinking also when we brought up, oh.
We can hear you.
Is it better now?
Yeah, we can hear you okay. Your
Okay,
screen
good.
freezes. It's okay.
I was thinking
can hear
about the counties that are the places that can't reopen and thinking that we have, you know what, I'm turning my video's off. So the areas where we have families who feel uncomfortable returning to school because of stigmas around the coronavirus, et cetera, might have more families who need other options. And I don't think that this plan takes those into account or takes into account how to make it comfortable for all of those families to return full-time or in person at all.
Got it. Got it. So I'm hearing that's not equitable. It's not taking into account some of the things that are actually happening on the ground level. Now, let me ask you this. Do any of you feel like what currently is going on is equitable, just distance learning, right? I know you kind of have kids coming back here and there, but just in general, was distance learning when schools were closed, was that equitable? And I think many of you would say, no, right? Not necessarily, but I'm going to throw a monkey wrench in here. For some kids, it actually worked for. For some kids, it actually did work for. Didn't work for all kids, but for some it did. Some kids are doing exceptionally well. And so even the concept of reopening, right? We know that that is really more of the effective way to address all kids in general. But for some kids, reopening may not be equitable for them. They may go back to a system that was not equitable in the first place, right? So then what we're seeing is now adding another layer of inequities. And again, not having a plan to address that is a problem, very problematic. And so as you think about my question to you, right? I didn't expect you to say it was equitable. But I do want to say this very question that I asked you has to be the same question we ask about everything that comes across our desk. Is it equitable? Because as you know, the state legislation, anything that comes from the federal government, anything related to governing schools that comes down the hill, and you know what I'm talking about, the stuff that comes down the hill. In the end, it lands in our laps. And then what do we have to do? We have to make decisions of what to do with that money. Right? What do we do with this particular space to make sure it's equitable and how it lands in the trenches works for our kids, right? So that's why we have to always interrogate, is it equitable? Trustee Duran, jump in.
I hope I don't take this away from what you were just talking about in terms of the focus, but in terms of, you know, kids doing better at home remotely raises to me lots of questions. You know, why would kids be more successful at home than they would be at a school site on, you know, intermingling with their friends and the teachers? And so there are all kinds of possibilities that come up, just
absolutely
all kinds in terms of how equitable were the schools in the first place.
In the first place, there you go.
In the very first place. And then there's, you know, there's individual differences and kids that are introverts and they would, you know, maybe not feel so forced, more comfortable at home. Tons of reasons. And then there, on the other hand, am I yelling? And then on the other hand, there's the kids that are desperate to go back to school. And what are the differences between that? I mean, it's, and yet, so there's, I mean, we could look at so many different factors and then have to tear those apart.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for just trying to unpack that in itself. And you asked the question, why? And I think as a governance team, one of the things that's so important is asking the question, is it equitable? But then the why, right? So then we got to unpack this, because during distance learning, right, like it didn't work well for our kids. And I think about, like, I have 3 children who all are in distance learning, right? They're 7 years old, 2nd grade. The other one is 8th grade, and the oldest is 12th grade. And what I found is that all 3 of them have a different experience, same house, same computer structure, all of that, but it doesn't work well for all of them. And so what my epiphany is the oldest one is thriving. She's been on the honor roll for St. Mary's High School right down the street from y'all for 2 trimesters in a row. She has straight A's. And you know, that school is not an easy school to do that. But the reality is that, you know what worked different for her is that the structure changed. She had more time. This works for her learning style, right? She had more time. She didn't have to get up at God knows what time in the morning to come from Vallejo all the way out to Berkeley. But also there was this sense of what's happening in the classrooms. And so I appreciate you asking that. Why is it better, or why is it equitable or not equitable? What is the kids' experience? So it makes me go now to the next step is y'all are going to reopen, right? Like the bottom line is you're going to reopen. How you reopen looks different for every district, but your kids are going to come back. But I go back to thinking about, as a governance team, do we want kids to go back to exactly the same way it was before COVID-19 came? And that's going to be what you're going to wrestle when we talk about inequitable systems in place. We knew when I did your training with you the first time, that was before COVID-19. And we were talking about inequities then. Nothing has changed. The only difference now is we've had time to think and reflect. And now we've seen kids learn in a different modality, and we see what works well, what doesn't. So when we go back, are we going to continue to do the same thing, or are we going to make some adjustments and make it actually equitable based on our control, not necessarily what the government, the federal government, state government passes down, whatever framework even is given. The bottom line is once it gets to us, we actually have control over what that looks like. And so I commend you again, Dr. Wells, on providing the space, the governance team providing the space, right? And time for your site leaders to wrestle with this, because they're the ones that have to take that vision, right? And now think about, how do we redo master scheduling, right? Who gets what teacher, right? Who gets what schedule? How do we find out and build those relationships where there may be a bridge that was lost because of distance learning? Where now we're figuring out, we got to figure out how to bridge that. And so as a governance team, remember, you operate at the policy level. So those are the questions you have to ask, right? And then you have a superintendent and a staff, right, that comes together and says, here's what we're doing, right? Here's how. But that question, is it equitable? It doesn't matter if it's a governor's plan, anything that comes across your desk, is it equitable? And so I want you to be thinking about that. Okay, is it equitable? Now, here's the tricky part. Even if that plan was equitable, you know that that's just half the battle. The other part of the battle is now it's time to implement, right? And when it goes to the ground level, who has to implement your vision? It's your teachers, right? It's your classified staff, it's the folks who are in the trenches with your kids. And one of the things we have to recognize is it equitable is a question up here at this level, but is that the same mindset that exists in the ground level? And this is the harder work, is dealing with the mindsets of our staff, right? Our community, to shift to a paradigm of equity. And so do you all remember we read the article, Water System Change? Y'all remember that? It's been a minute. The water system change. Been a while. I'll show you the image, give you a better sense of, let's see, this particular article. Remember this? So your leadership team has gotten a hold of it. Yeah, it's been a while. I really recommend that you spend some time going back to looking at, okay, how are we going to address these complex issues of reopening schools or any other policy that you're going to wrestle with throughout the rest of the year and beyond? Because here's what's going to happen. You're going to have a structure that you're going to continue to ask, is it equitable? Policies, is it equitable? Our practices, are they equitable? And that article lays out, right, this structure that exists in the system. The resources, are they equitable? Because as a governance team, you oversee like the money, you oversee the time spent, the calendar, you oversee a whole lot, personnel, right? You have the vision for that, the structure of our district. But most critically, underneath that structure, you find the relationships and the power dynamics that exist amongst the people. And the hardest part of this work is the mental models. Remember that? The mindsets. Like, how are we going to help people come along to understand what equity looks like and why we're asking that question? Is it equitable? People have to have context for that. So this is the harder work that you're going to have to think about as a board, which is why we're doing professional learning, right, with leadership. This is why Dr. Wells has pulled community members and stakeholders together, why we have a student achievement task force. This is why we start to create these spaces so we can talk about it, we can wrestle with what equity means, and then we can start to think about how it's going to impact our structural change. But again, you remember I said earlier, go slow to go fast, right? This is a system change. So it's almost like moving the Titanic. Right? So it's literally going to take time. And this article was a great way for you to see how do we create system change with something as complex as equity in education. Okay, so if you didn't, I know Melissa and Veronica, this may be a new document that you will see, but definitely, I believe I put that in the packet. So you should have that in your board packet to look at. And I definitely recommend you take some time to take a look, because it is absolutely going to be critical as we go through our next study sessions. I'm going to constantly be referring to this water system change article and the framework for how we create systems change that becomes a legacy for you all, because you all will be on the board. How long you'll be on the board, you don't know. Maybe you'll be on there forever. Maybe you'll be on there another term. You never know, but you want to have a legacy of equity work. And the only way to create a legacy is to create system change, not just a Band-Aid effect. We do this 1 or 2 years and it's done. Right? So you have a great structure already in place with your board, your superintendent's a visionary for this work. You have all the ingredients to make this last, but you got to have a framework to do so. So it's a great resource for you. And I encourage you to go through it again if you've already read it, but definitely revisit that. Okay. All right. So now that I got you warmed up and we're talking about equity, let's actually define it again. So y'all remember how we defined equity? It's been a minute, so I'm just going to do a quick recap so to feel a little bit like water, drinking water from a fire hose. But I want to make sure to be fair to our new board members that we just kind of do a quick recap. And then honestly, all of us have slept since May. So we're just going to do a recap again. What does equity mean in education? Okay. So again, there's kind of 3 schools of thought. You know, what does equity mean? What are the challenges? And what do we do to create it? Okay, so remember, equity is not equality. It's not giving everyone the same thing. Equity is giving people what they need and when they need it. Okay, what they need when they need it. Dr. Jeffrey Duncan Andrade reminds us of that often, giving people what they need when they need it. Some need more than others. So as you continue to convince people that you're leading in this work, some need more than others. It's not going to always feel fair to people, but the reality is some need more than others. That's true meaning of fairness. Everyone gets what they need. Okay, student success is demonstrated in diverse ways. Remember, we're going to have to rethink how we define student success. We only have so many metrics. So what that means is someone's not going to be deemed successful in our system, but they're still brilliant. They're still talented. They have all the things they need, but we don't always measure that brilliance. So we have to think about equity in education is actually acknowledging that students demonstrate success in a lot of different ways, even though we don't measure it. The last part, this is the work. Equity in education is about intentionally shifting mindsets, policies, practices that prioritize the interruption of systemic inequities. So anything we do is about interrupting. That's what equity in education is. Okay, it's not rhetoric, as Dr. Wells said. I appreciate that word. You always remind me that, you know, it's not just talking about it. It's about doing the work, interrupting an inequitable system, which is what public education it is. Y'all did the history, right? And we'll do a quick recap, but y'all looked at the history. It wasn't designed to be equitable. So we have to kind of interrupt this system in order to create spaces that are equitable for kids. Now, the reality is that's not that easy, right? It's not that easy. And so we have to remember why it's not easy is there's several challenges. So one is the historical challenges are the system in itself. It wasn't designed to be. So I just shared that. Since the 1600s in America, public education was never designed to be equitable for all kids. Matter of fact, it wasn't even designed to be equal. Okay, so we got to remember that in itself is going to be a challenge. We have some structures in place that are hundreds of years old. There's going to be resistance. So everybody's not going to believe in this work, right? It's going to be resistance, pushback. So as a board, you got to be ready for that because you're interrupting. What are you interrupting? You're interrupting things like privilege and entitlement. right? There have been the system that has benefited some and disadvantaged and burdened others. And so when you interrupt privilege where people have actually benefited from this system, you're going to create pushback and resistance in itself. But I want to call out privilege in terms of educational privilege, right? All of us who are educators, we got privilege because we have power. And who do we have power over? Our students, our families, right? They don't make the decisions, we do. So we have to think about how that could be a barrier in itself, is that sometimes when we get uncomfortable, we can disengage in this work. We can disengage. That's what privilege is. I don't have to if I get uncomfortable. That's my definition, right? I don't have to acknowledge this, but we want to interrupt that, right? Entitlement is, I think it's owed to me, right? I earn this, right? That whole meritocracy kind of thinking, right? I earn this, so therefore I need to have this. And so we got to remember that sometimes that creates a whole opportunity to perpetuate oppression, continue to disadvantage those that don't have power and have been oppressed through the system. And then again, perpetuate the gap of those who have the privilege and benefit. Now, the other ones that are pretty heavy lifts, which we'll continue to unpack these words through the next couple of sessions kind of collectively, is unpacking the barriers, which include implicit bias. We talk about the blind spots, right? The blind spots that every individual has. There's no one that can opt out of implicit bias. We all got it. So we just have to accept it. We have to acknowledge it. Then we interrupt that, right? But those blind spots that sometimes interfere with our decisions, because sometimes they're based on stereotypes and not the truth. Stereotypes, but not the truth. Narratives, but not the truth. And so that's when we get to learn student stories. We get to learn about the truth about folks who maybe we've never heard their stories before, right? The voices of those that we don't hear as much. Okay, that's where we start to really interrupt. And most critically, you all know that the concept of race and racism is probably one of those topics that is most uncomfortable to talk about. But as a governance team, we will have to get to a place where we can be very bold and courageous to talk about the institution of education and how racism permeates through policies and practices that are baked in a system, right? They've been there, and they absolutely chronically disadvantage groups of kids based on race, and they chronically give advantage to kids based on race. And that's why Dr. Wells was so instrumental, I think, in bringing that student achievement task force, developing that even more, because that equity gap, that achievement gap, is not because kids aren't brilliant. That is because we have a system that perpetuates what we call racist practices. But I want to be clear, some of us get stuck on racism as individual, like racist acts, right? One-time things, those things that are from person to person. Okay, yes, those are dangerous and very harmful. But for educators, we got to recognize institutional racism absolutely is the most harmful space, because it's a system, right? And generation to generation, you see it impact our students and our families, and we got to interrupt that. But that's going to take some time. It's going to take some time. Now, the last piece is, what do we do? You know, some of you are like, okay, Nicole, I've known you for a couple of years now. I've heard this before. Tell me what to do. Give me the magic wand. Give me the list. Give me the checklist, right? And I do have a checklist. I got one for you. But I want to make sure we can be clear about this. It doesn't matter what the checklist is if we don't approach it with a systems lens, meaning it's not just about changing policy. It's not just about moving the resources around. It's not just about changing people's practice. It's about getting deep into the weeds with the people of the system. We got relationships that have to be repaired and bridged. We have voices that need to be at the table. So again, I commend you on having your student leaders be on your board. Those voices have to be heard. And then, of course, I said earlier, you got to change the mental models. Ooh, that's a lot of work. And that's why it's not that easy. So I'm going to give you an example, governance team. You're going to look at things like grading policies, homework policies. I can keep going down the list, right? And you're going to look at things and ask your superintendent, why does this equity gap exist? And then you're going to ponder what do we need to do as a board to change that? And then you're going to come up with brilliant research-based practices and policies that you're going to pass. But then what you're going to find is they may not last. They may not be implemented with fidelity because we didn't work on the mindsets of those that we're asking to do the work. So I want you to try, well, I don't want you to try this, but I want you to imagine trying this. That literally tomorrow you said, we're no longer giving any D's or F's ever in our system ever again. I want you to think about that, because D's or F's are inherently inequitable. They're contrary to what we say we want from kids to be college and career ready, right? We know college particularly D's and F's aren't flying, right? And again, as a teacher who did not give D's or F's, I didn't have the option because our grading system did not allow it. We had A, B, C, I. Why do I bring this up? Great policy, right? It forced me to teach my kids the first time and I had to stay with them until they got it. That incomplete, that's what an I is. That changed to an A, B, or C. What was the difference? My mindset had to change because I was used to giving D's and F's. That is not an option, but that's not that easy to just say, hey, I want you to change your grading policy. You got to work on the mindsets. You got to work on making sure teachers at the table even having that conversation, right? We have to collectively do this work together. And that's why I say it's not that easy just to give you the checklist, because I can tell you what equitable policies and practices you should have in the district. But remember, you got hundreds of years of ways we do things. And Albany Unified is no different from many districts all over the world, right? We got work to do. So you see where I'm going with this is to go slow to go fast, but we want your legacy to last. We want it to be a legacy, not just a moment in time. And then we call it what we call the Band-Aid, or it sounds cool because it's exciting right now. It's everybody's doing it. We want this to be a legacy. So that's why I push you to go slow to go fast and unpack it. Make sense? All right, any thoughts or questions before I do a quick recap again for the things that you went over the last session? Again, for our new members and just for us to just kind of have a quick just overview. All right, we're good. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna, my thoughts as you were kind of going through that is I kind of had two thoughts. One, I think that the concept of racism is sometimes confused, especially when we're talking about schools and like policies and different things that are happening. I think that often people will kind of look at situations and say, you know, I'm not racist. And it's like, well, of course I'm not racist. I love Black people. Like, it's great. Or I love people of color. Like, I'm not, you know, and it's like, the line gets blurred because it's not necessarily you're putting on like a white hat and burning crosses in people's lawn. Like, that's not what we're talking about. But when people think about racism, that's where I think they're naturally, that's where their mind goes. Like, I'm not racist because I'm not calling you names to your face.
Right.
And so I think that makes things like kind of.
It does, yeah.
You know, kind of tough.
Yeah.
And then the second thing that I was thinking about, which I think is really hard, and I'm only speaking for myself. It makes it really hard, is that when you're looking at policies or things that are being introduced or things that are being presented, and you're thinking that I need to look at this through an equitable lens, and is this equal? You're making a decision, or you're maybe pushing back on a presentation from somebody who's been doing it for 30 years. And so it makes it really tough because either you come across as like you're not respecting your years and years of experience. And that is not your goal, but that's how it comes across. And so that's what makes this work. Really
good point.
I'm hoping that we'll dive into that as we continue.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought up both. Okay, so both of them we're definitely going to unpack over the course of our next study sessions, but just to give you a brief kind of, just connection to that is the first is we have to define language. So I think part of when you mentioned like, people have a hard time when we talk about racism and racist and those kind of words, right? Without unpacking them and really defining them, that's where it becomes very conflicting and becomes uncomfortable because we are not all on the same page, right? So as a governance team, we're going to talk about like how do we ensure we all have common language, right? Because we all come from different spaces, so we have to have common language. So then I want to go into your second question or your kind of comment about when you ask questions, right? Not only of staff, but anyone, right? You're asking about, is this equitable? And it appears you're kind of pushing back, right? And so remember, in a governance space, we have to have a culture of how we ask questions. But that culture in terms of our equity lens comes from starting back to, well, what does equity mean in the first place? right? And that's why we have to define equity as a team, because then when we ask questions, there's no assumptions that we're pushing back. We're just asking the question that we all know was coming anyway. And eventually becomes a culture where you don't have to ask those questions anymore. It's just what we do, right? So those presentations become really what they not only expect you to see, but also that it's based on our why, like our collective why. And so that's where we talk about effective governance practices, which will, I think, address both of those comments that you shared. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. Yeah, thank you. Veronica, jump in.
Okay, you guys, my phone connected on audio tonight. It's a game changer. So I love your example of the incomplete grade, because it's the scaffolding process for the students to build to success. And I think for me, that's not racial, that's nothing. That's just good practices as a person. So for me, that just reshaped my entire perspective of your presentation here on a much deeper level. Really want to thank you for that. It is what Vice President Doss just brought up, and you followed through on, is the culture of how we ask questions to check for equity. And I would love input and guidance from you on strategy for us to move in that direction.
Absolutely. No, you're in the right place, Veronica. Honestly, that is the crux of why we do study sessions with board members around effective governance with an equity lens. So the questions you ask, kind of the structure, the common language, we're going to actually go through all of that and make sure that you all feel like you have a common way of doing this work together with an equity lens. So absolutely. And we'll definitely unpack the grading one at a later time. I didn't want to go too much in the weeds, but I wanted to give you all an example of how you're going to have to think about some things may have to change. And we got to think, though, it's not that easy. It has to be something that is inherently believed in by everybody, right? We can't force it down people's throat. We have to do this in a way that's really collaborative. And again, mindsets have to be addressed. Clementina, jump in.
You're muted, Trustee Durham.
Get you every time.
Thank you, VP. It's hard for me to deal with equity a lot, in the sense that, as Veronica said, at some point, everybody is in these positions of not being equal, because the US society, the way it was built, was around inequality. So that at some point, everybody's experience is unequal. Take women, right? And the glass ceiling. That's one system. Then you have kids, special kids that participate in special education, and how their access to education is very different, than other students. I remember affirmative action when it came about as a way of addressing inequities in higher ed, and then it went from there to jobs in terms of people of color. But then it got appropriated, and which I'm not necessarily saying is bad, but it went from people of color to women in general, because women are also, treated unequally. So it's kind of like it's built not only into the educational system, but into our whole society. So that the way you describe equity today, the definitions here, the 4 definitions to me is very open. And anybody can jump in and talk about unequal status that they may have at any given moment in life. So my original definition was based on the historical oppression and lack of access that people of color had. But once again, people with disability can go through whole history of education and say the same thing. And women can say the same thing. So that I think you're talking about a definition that we can all agree to, because here in Albany, everybody uses the word equity.
Equity,
And it means so many things to so many different things to different people.
Yeah. Well, Clementina, it's funny. You're like reading my mind. Watch this. This is very interesting. And I realized that one part of the slide never did load up. So let me get out of this one. I was talking about this, but didn't realize it never loaded. Way this simply comes straight out of the article, water system change, just so you know. Just for 1 second, because I think I'm getting kicked out of Zoom, so it'll reconnect me in a moment. This happens some. To pause for a second. And as I'm pausing, this might be a good time. Stretch your legs, your arms. I think it's going to kick me out, and then I'll be right back in. But just do a quick stretch. This is when Zoom reminds me, your clients need a break. All right, let's see if it'll keep me in or kick me out. Let's see. All right, there it was. It kicked me out, right? All right, so I'm back at it. Keep stretching. Make sure you do your chair yoga. Stretch your legs, your ankles, your toes, all that good stuff. If you're sitting in a chair, if some of you need to stand, please do so, because I know this is it's been a long couple of days, weeks, years, you name it. But just continue to take care of yourself as we're moving through this. Okay, but I want to just respond for a moment to Clementina's comment about how we all see equity very differently. And so do you all remember the elephant and the blind men poem? Do you remember I brought that up the last time? Right? And this is going to be a very interesting space that you'll be in as a governance team. Is that we talked earlier, like equity and equality aren't the same thing. Obviously, we have some issues around reality, right? You've seen this picture of the kids on the boxes watching the baseball game, right? And you see all the different ways that you can look at how equity has not taken place. But I want to speak to what you shared just now about the elephant, the blind man, and connect it to equity. You all are going to be, encouraged to create an equity statement that you will evolve and get feedback from your stakeholders to really ensure that your lens for equity, your why, is really centered around what your kids and your families need. And so one of the things you're going to find that's going to be really interesting is this elephant and blind man process, right? Where the elephant is like this big thing called equity, but it has lots of different parts to it. And so you'll see like one of the blind men is grabbing on the elephant, and it's like, oh, the one that's holding on to the tail, it's calling it a rope. The other one, and that's his perspective, right? The other one's grabbing the ear and it's calling it a fan. I mean, just way off, right? They're all wrong, but then they're all right. And the reason they're all right is because they all have different perspectives that they bring to this space. And that's what's going to happen for you all when you think about your governance team, right? I kind of joke about the elephant and the blind man. It's like 5 board members and the superintendent, right? And you all are going to wrestle with what equity means to you. One of you are going to say it's about racism, right? It's about inequities in this system. We got to address race. Some of you might say it's about our kids with special needs. One of you might be like, no, this is about our English learners. For God's sake, this has been going on for a long time. We got this gap with our English learners. It's about our kids who identify as LGBTQ. Some of you may even go as deep and call out something that we don't even keep data on, but it's very impactful for our kids, is religion. This is about inequities around religious oppression. Ooh. You see where I'm going, where it gets very messy because everybody's right. But then everybody may be wrong at times. And I'm going to tell you why. Is that the elephant is like this big concept of equity with lots of different parts. And at any given time, if we as a board, we look at data and we say, hey, we're going to address the achievement gap, right? And we're going to address it based on what we see. We see there's inequities in that there's a group of kids at the bottom of the achievement gap who aren't being served well. Let's talk about them, and let's talk about them based on language, English learners. Would you all agree you have some type of achievement gap with English learners? Right? Most districts do. Someone's going to say, well, wait a minute, what about African-American kids? Do we have an achievement gap with African-American kids? Absolutely. But wait, what about our kids with an IEP? Do we have an achievement gap with our kids who have IEPs? So here's the difference, is we all agree equity is about all our kids, because as a governance team, we got to serve everybody in the district. And equity matters for every child. But when it's important to hold the space for the group you're looking at in that data, in that conversation, you got to hold that space and you got to be okay with it. So if we're going to talk about race and the achievement gap associated with race and our kids based on their racial ethnic backgrounds, we got to hold it there and be okay with that. And we don't, what we call it, let's talk about other areas, other focus areas, because that's where we miss targeting our work. So the elephant blind man process is going to happen for you quite a bit, but you can't even have that real focus work as a team if we don't come up with a common understanding of what the elephant is and agree that the elephant has different parts, period. Equity is about giving kids what they need, but every kid is not monolithic. They all have different needs. So that's where we have to come to an agreement that we might have to do things a little differently depending on who kids are. But it's all about equity. And equity applies to all kids, meaning we got some babies who have everything they need. That kid with the blue shirt, the tallest one, has what they need, right? That's what you see in the picture. But what we don't know is if that kid is a high achiever, gets great grades, is going to all kinds of great colleges, but then feels suicidal, has poor relationships with their peers, doesn't have high self-esteem. Did we miss something? Equity applies to them too. But then when we're talking about kids who have historically been like the kid with the purple shirt, we also got to recognize equity is about closing gaps, right? And sometimes when we think about that, it's not about every other kid. It's about the kids we're closing gaps for. And typically when we close those gaps, you know what? It's usually good for all kids. And that's what we're going to wrestle with as a team. But again, where do we start as a governance team? We have to have common language, because each of you individually cannot do this work. As a matter of fact, your role isn't to do this work. That's the role of the superintendent and the staff, right? And this work becomes messy. It becomes very passionate. It's emotional, because all of us have experienced inequities in the system some way, shape, or form, every one of us. And so as our passion starts to show and our emotions start to show, we talk about the fact that the role of the superintendent and the role of the board are very different in how we address this work. Our role as a board is to have the vision and the common language to say, this is the elephant. And we respect and honor all the different parts of the elephant. That's the work of coming up with an equity statement. Now, if you're curious what an equity statement might look like, because I know you all been working at this, so I want to make sure I respect and honor the work you've done, but I want to get you to a place of evolving kind of your vision for equity to a place where you are at a common place where you can not only adopt it, embed it in your policy, and really use that as your guide for everything you do. I want to give you a little context, and this is right down the street from you, Oakland, California. Uh-oh, did my slide not load? Where'd it go? One sec, where did my slide go? There it is. Right down the street, Oakland, California, the National Equity Project. This is an example of equity. There are numerous boards around the state that actually have adopted this as their statement. So I'm sharing that with you and using that as a lens for them making decisions as they govern. So I just want to give you an example. Some have created their own statements, but this is one that some have adopted. Okay. Take a look at what's coming up for you. Again, a lot of this I showed, I believe the last time, I can't recall if we showed this in May, but for our new board members, this is something that definitely want to think about, like, okay, what does equity mean? We've said it a lot, but here's an actual definition. Okay, about giving kids what they need, both academic and social potential. I think we all agree that that's a great idea. It's about the whole child, but how it looks in action is interrupting, right, inequitable practices, removing the predictability of success or failure. So when you look at data, you no longer can predict without even guessing that who's going to be at the bottom of the achievement gap, because I know y'all can do that right now, right? 5 years ago, did the data look very similar? Probably. 10 years ago, did the data look similar? Probably, right? Some things you can predict, and it's not because the kids aren't brilliant. It's because simply we have a system that's baked in with inequities that we have to address. Okay, ensuring equally high outcomes for all kids. Equally high outcomes for all kids. Everybody can see the baseball game, right? That's the goal. This is also about understanding every kid is brilliant. Every one of them has great talent, skills, unique talent, skills, and just, I call it brilliance. I have not yet met a kid yet who's not brilliant. But somehow our data doesn't show up like that. And that's something we have to say, okay, is equity happening? Can we measure this and use this as a statement to measure that this is happening in our district? And that's where we talk about why you want a statement. It's our lens by which we ask questions. It's our lens by which we do our work. But again, without having that statement in common and language, you're all going to be kind of all over the place, because it's like, okay, we all have different thoughts, and that's okay. But we got to get to a place, again, this is the elephant. Here's equity. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to give you an opportunity to not hear Nicole Anderson, and I'm going to let you hear a gentleman by the name of Dr. Pedro Noguera. You all heard of Dr. Noguera? Okay, he's out of USC right now, kind of a guru around the nation, around the world, and does great, amazing work, was a former practitioner, and now really helps folks to kind of get to a place of understanding what equity looks like in action as well. So I'm going to give you an opportunity to hear him. And as you're listening, I'm going to ask you to write down and share what your definition of equity is, because I want to take that down, and then I'm going to use that for our future sessions to continue to help you build and come up with a common language and definition in the form of an equity statement that's going to show up in your policy, okay? So I'm going to have you here, Dr. Noguera. If you want to stand up and listen to him, that might be a great idea, just so you can stretch your legs. If you want to sit, it's fine, but just want to make sure you have an opportunity to continue to stay mobile and move in a little bit, because you've been sitting for quite some time, for a couple of nights now. All right. So again, listening to Dr. Noguera, you're going to hear a couple examples, context, think about what connections you might be making to your equity statement that we're going to evolve together. Okay, and it still didn't work. Try one more time. I need to share the sound, Nicole. There we go. All right, now. Let's see, so we can hear Dr. Noguera. All right. Dr. Well,
in the context of education, the term equity has come to mean the need to focus
Can y'all hear it okay?
directly, not simply on equal opportunity, that is making sure that kids have access to schools and the opportunity theoretically to learn, but really focusing on outcomes and results. And the analogy I often make is most parents practice equity with their kids. That is, we don't treat all kids the same because they have different needs. And when in schools that are really focused on equity, they're trying to meet the different needs of kids and do so in ways with a focus on outcomes. Schools are set up to be the equalizer of opportunity. That was the mandate early on, was that we would use education to promote merit, to promote talent. And so theoretically, you'd want to make sure that all kids, regardless of background, got similar educational opportunities. But that's not what we do. Obviously, if you go to school in the South Bronx, you get a very different education than if you go to schools in Scarsdale. But what's more, even within schools, we exacerbate inequity, because in many schools, there's a deliberate practice of assigning the best teachers to teach the highest achieving kids and the least effective and least experienced teachers to teach the high need kids. This never works, but schools consistently do it, largely because it serves their political purposes of both appeasing the parents of the high achieving kids and appeasing teachers with seniority. Parents play a critical role in influencing what schools do, and sometimes they can exacerbate the inequities. And that's because the affluent parents who are highly educated and have lots of time on their hands can put pressure on the schools to get what they want. You can never blame a parent for trying to get the best for their kids. However, sometimes what that means is that some kids are getting more because their parents are able to put the pressure on, lobby the schools to get resources directed at their kids, whereas other parents either don't have the time, don't have the know-how, or aren't treated in the same way when they engage schools, and therefore their kids don't get served as well. Well, the only way to really create equitable schools is to really focus on that as your goal, and making sure that, first of all, you have good leaders who have a vision that combines a commitment to academic excellence to a commitment to equity. And that's important because in this country, we tend to see the two as being conflicting goals. We tend to think that the more we do for excellence, the less we'll be able to do for equity, because in our mind, there's only a small number of elite kids who are excellent, and we're going to give more to them. And that's what, for example, we're doing gifted programs. We give them the best, and then we forget about the rest of the kids. So we build in inequity. When we combine excellence and equity, what we're focused on is how do we make sure that all kids are exposed to high standards, quality teachers? How do we make sure that even the kids who come in who are further behind, who need more help, get that help? What we really should be aiming for are kids who are learning ideas, knowledge, and skills that they can apply to their own situation. So they can understand the utility of what they learn and how it's relevant to their life circumstances. So I'll give you one example. A teacher I was working with in Oakland, California, she had to teach environmental history, or environmental science rather, and she was interested in making connections between the students' lives that she was teaching and the subject. And so what she did, she asked me how she should approach it. I said, well, why don't you spend some time exploring this neighborhood, and you might get some ideas about the most critical environmental issues in this neighborhood. And the neighborhood was West Oakland. It's a neighborhood that has a lot of heavy industry, a lot of traffic. It's an area with a lot of toxic sites. And as she drove the community, she saw that. She also saw that there were a lot of families in that community that had gardens in the backyard. And she imagined that many of those families were eating fruits and vegetables from those gardens. and not aware of the fact that the soil was probably contaminated with lead that was coming into the soil from the atmosphere. So what she did was she designed a whole unit with her students, for her students, on the effects of lead in the environment. And it started by showing how lead goes from the industry or from the cars into the atmosphere, how it goes from the atmosphere into the soil through the rain, what happens when you how it goes from the soil into the plants, and then what happens when you ingest those plants, particularly in small children whose brains are first developing, and lead contamination really can have a very damaging effect on the development of children's brains. She then taught her kids how to do soil testing, and they went out into the community to test the soil for lead content, and they mapped where the lead contamination was greatest, and they produced these very intricate charts showing what was causing this contamination, that is, its proximity to a freeway or to a foundry or some other kind of heavy industry. After they produced the report, the kids were very concerned because of what they had learned. And they said to the teacher that they felt they had to do more than merely produce the report, that they needed to do something with the information now. And she agreed, and they contacted the county health commissioner and approached the county health commissioner about doing something about this problem. And after reading their report, hearing them speak very intelligently and passionately about this problem, what the county health commission agreed to do was, first of all, send out a letter to all the residents in this neighborhood in West Oakland, warning them of the effects of toxics, lead and lead contamination in the soil, but also offering free topsoil for any family that wanted gardens but didn't have the ability to get clean topsoil. And I often point that as an example because my bet is that those kids will know about the effects of lead in the environment forever. And that's because they were able to see how what they were learning could be used in a way that could really improve their lives and their community.
All right. So now you got Dr. Noguera putting in his perspective, stirring it up again. Some more examples, more context. So now you've had a couple of different ways to hear what equity is. Okay, so as you heard Dr. Noguera, I want you to be thinking about how might I define equity to contribute to our equity statement. Okay, so you got kind of three different, you got a National Equity Project, Dr. Noguera's perspective, and then you also have the image, right, of the kids on the baseball, at the baseball field. And you also have your context of what equity means to you. So I want you to write it down, okay? And the way I want you to write it is you can write your full dissertation on a piece of paper. That's great. But what I'm going to ask from you is just one word that sticks out the most, that describes how you describe equity, how you see equity. Okay, so I'm going to start with that first, and then we'll unpack it a little bit more, and then we're going to move into our next study session. We're going to keep going deeper and deeper. Okay, so this is one of those non-closure moments. You don't have to get it all tonight, but we're just kind of what is contextually, what does equity mean to us? So I'm just going to call some names, and I just want you to give me one word first. Okay, so I'm going to start with our fearless student leaders. Audrey, why don't you go first? What does equity mean to you? Give me a word that describes it.
I don't know if this is the best word that I can think of.
All right, you can cheat and give me two. How about that?
Okay, I'll give you one. Creation.
Creation. All right. All right. Leo, jump in.
Commitment.
Commitment. Powerful. Clementina, jump in. What word came to mind for you? Think about
Relevancy.
Relevancy. Got it. All right. Brian, there you are. Why don't you jump in? What came up for you?
Passion.
Passion. Got it. All right. Sarah.
Understanding.
Understanding. Good. All right. Let's see, Veronica.
Connection.
Connection. All right, Melissa.
Shared.
One more time. Sorry, cut off.
Shared.
Shared. All right. Got it. Okay. All right. And Dr. Wells, how can I forget you?
Different.
Different. Got it. All right. I think I got everyone. Yes. All right. Perfect. So I'm looking at a lot of different words, and notice what just happened. Remember that elephant blind man concept? Not one of you said the same word. This is throwing me off. I'm trying to create a statement with y'all, right? And none of you said the same word. So what that means is now if I go around and ask you again, like, why did you pick that word, right? Then you're going to give me your dissertation version, right? This is why. Here's the context. And what's going to start to happen is you're going to start to tell me a story, right? You're going to tell me a connection to your own experience. And then what's going to happen is each of you are going to notice like, wow, like we really have an interesting context around equity. There's richness in all these diverse perspectives, but we still got to come up with a statement, right? We still got to come up with a common language that we are going to have as a board to say, when we say equity, when we ask the question, is that equitable? Is that equity? That we all have common language, right? So as you think about your definition, you all have it written down, your dissertation version. Do you have that? Now, normally if I was with you in person, I'd be like, hand me your piece of paper, right? Hand it to me, right? So what I'm going to ask that you do is hold on to it for a moment. And if you, I hate saying it like this, I've done this with folks, like if you want to email it to Julie or you want to email it to me, if you just want to hold on to it, because we're going to continue to unpack this, because the more context you get, the more your definition might change. Your word actually might change. But one of the things we do is I tell boards, don't rush to create a statement, because you have to learn more about what equity means based on different perspectives. If I pause and went with your students, because I've sat with your students before, I had an amazing opportunity with your City of Albany SEJC committee, right, commission, and we sat and did a student forum and listened to their definitions of equity. Theirs were a little different from yours. Now, not that it's a bad thing, it's just there's different contexts, right? So we have to continue to get that context and evolve so that we can really collectively say equity means this. You see where I'm going? Okay, so now with your equity definitions that you have written down, I want you to continue to add to it as you think of other things you hear tonight. And then at the end, we'll have you somehow share it so I can get it and continue to add to the collective equity statement, because I want to take your feedback and I'm going to give it back to you so that you all can wrestle some more about what does equity actually mean and have a statement that's embedded in your equity policy. Okay, so we're going to keep working on that, but it's okay to put a little pin in it for a moment. Okay, but we're going to keep going back to your statement. I'm keeping my words right here that you've shared. Okay, now you had an opportunity, and I'm gonna give you a little bit more info. Okay, and just a quick time check too, President Hinckley, I just want to double check. I know we started about 10 minutes late, so are you okay with us going to 9:10 or 9:15? I just want to double check first because we start a little late, but I want to make sure because I want to condense a couple of things if necessary.
I think 10 minutes or 15 minutes is okay. And then
Okay.
I think we're all gonna
Okay.
turn into
We're
pumpkins.
turning to pumpkins, right? No,
Yeah.
exactly. I told you, like drinking water from a fire hose. You're gonna go, I don't even know how much water I drink. I just got some sprinkles. Okay, so that's good to do a time check. So I just appreciate that, just to make sure. So what I want to do is I want to give you a little bit more context about kind of tying in what does equity mean when we talk about with a governance lens, right? With an equity lens or governance. And one of the things we're going to have to continue to do in unpacking our definition is we're going to have to think about, okay, we know we have a vision for equity and we're still evolving our statement, but then how do we evolve it even more, understanding why equity is not even in our district completely, right? Like what are those gaps that exist? So that's going to be the question we'll have to think about. What are those gaps that actually exist in our school district, right? And so recognizing that as we evolve our statement, we got to remember there's several equity gaps. The achievement gap, we all kind of understand that. We talked about that, right? Your academic metrics, your test scores, you name it. We also have a disproportionality gap, right? So we have certain kids who get suspended, referred, disciplined more than others. And when we say disproportionate, what we mean is they usually are a small group of kids, but they make up the most of the discipline, records, right? So that's this disproportionality. It's not really representative of where the kids are in terms of the collective body. Okay, so one of the things to think about is the data that shows up in that gap. Okay, so that may make you think more about, okay, that equity statement. Access. So we've heard of the access gap before. So this is a big one, right? Access gap. This typically shows up in your master schedules. So as you think about the work of the principals, right, they create the master schedule, they take the vision from school district leadership, from the board, here's what it looks like. You got all these different ways to put kids into a schedule. And guess what happens? Some kids don't have access, right, to higher advanced courses, right, with GATE, AP, you name it, whatever the fancy words are, right? Everyone doesn't have the same access. And then I also want to bring up, everyone doesn't have the same level of experience or quality of teachers, right? So we know all of our teachers are quality. That's why we hired them, right? Okay, so it's no offense to any teacher, but we also know that there's a best fit for kids, right? Every kid doesn't necessarily work well with every teacher. So we have to think about who has the experienced teacher, right? And sometimes the experienced teachers aren't always with the kids who need the most experienced teachers. Sometimes our brand new teachers, I was meeting with some today, and I was thinking about, oh, I hope the principal don't give them the kids who have the most needs. They need the most energy. They need the most experience in terms of how to address some of those needs that experienced teachers have sometimes. So that's an access issue, right? Now, the opportunity gap is related to things like our English learners, right? Who has access, and then who has opportunity to graduate and be college and career ready? Because that's ultimately your goal, right? They leave your system, they can go be whatever they want to be in their career, or they can go to college, right? Some kids don't have that same opportunity. And English learners is a great example when we talk about the track, right? When I'm an English learner, if I'm not reclassified by a certain period of time, I become a long-term English learner. And that means my coursework looks different and then creates a space in my schedule where I don't get to take certain core classes or certain electives. So now my opportunity to graduate A through G ready and college ready is diminished. My opportunity is not there. And it's, again, not because I'm not brilliant. It's just that I mark that box that I don't speak English or read English proficiently enough based on the metrics that we have in our school system. So those are some of the gaps, right? Equity gaps. And those are the data points that Dr. Wells brings to you from the Student Achievement Task Force. That's the information that when you get those presentations and you ask questions, these are the things that come up and we have to interrogate what these mean, right? These all are associated with data. If those of you that are interested in looking up on your own, there's a website, and it's not super duper accurate, but it gives you a big picture, really helpful, and it coupled with your dashboard. And it's a website that's centered around, they call it miseducation data, right? And it gives you a sense about, okay, where are those kind of trends that are showing up in terms of racial disparities, in terms of all the different kind of the gaps that I just shared here. It's a very interesting way to look at it. So I'll make sure that I don't think I can share it with you in this way. I just have it on the slide, but let me see if you can see it there. So you see how it looks like this, and you can place your a particular district in. And just another way to look at some of the ways that you can see comparability to other districts who are similar, who are not similar, and literally looking up every school. And this is another way to look at things that don't show up in the dashboard. But I always say to board members, you got to be data savvy, right? You have multiple forms of data, not just one. So this talks about miseducation, right? Racial divides, opportunity gap, discipline gap, percentage of students who may not be supported as well in the system. So it's a very interesting data point to look at. Okay, we're not going to go too deep into it, but just another form of data that exists. So as a board, you have to be very mindful that there's lots of different ways to collect data. You just have to know how to ask that and also know how to interrogate the data to understand there's a big picture, but there's kids in this data, right? So this data is not the only story. So you always got to remember that, especially stuff that's public, right? You got to remember, how do you ask those questions? Okay, jump in, Veronica.
Can I just have the last slide when you had the 4 equity gaps for 1 sec?
Oh yeah, sure, not a problem. And by the way, this particular website is called propublica.org. Okay, that was the one, just so you all had an idea. Okay, this is one particular one. All right, but yeah, let me go back to that one.
Just where you have the 4 listed, I'm just writing down the reason for opportunity gap that you stated.
Oh, I'm sorry. So the opportunity gap related to the English learners?
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, for English learners, yep. So English learners, in terms of being reclassified, often their schedules look a little different based on what support they need, like ELD instruction and sometimes electives, things like that become less, there's less room in their schedule. So then what happens is it impacts them in the long run. That's why we don't want to always have long-term English learners, right? We call them L-tails, right? That's not something we want because it does impact. And that's just one example. One example. Another example, honestly, is counselors. So I just want to throw that out. Opportunity gaps happen sometimes because of counselors. And I say counselors not individually, but counseling as a whole in terms of the system about who encourages kids to take what classes, right? Who encourages kids to say, hey, I see your brilliance. I think you should be able to go into this class because I think you'll be able to do really well. And sometimes when we have historically, sometimes the narrative comes with, oh, you know what? I don't think that's good for you. I think you should go and take that class. And so sometimes we call it kill kids' dreams. And then they don't even take courses that could really support them in the long run. That creates an opportunity gap too, and an access gap. They kind of go hand in hand. Sometimes just lack of information. Parents don't necessarily have, like Dr. Noguera said, parents don't always have the know-how to even know how to advocate, right? To say, hey, I want my kid to take these classes. Or inviting our kids to take AP and honors courses. Some kids don't ever feel like that's a course for them because they haven't even been invited to think they could take the class, right? Things like that show up in sometimes our unwritten policies. Okay. Now, real quick, I said this earlier, and this is just a recap. Why do the gaps exist? Remember, we have a system that wasn't designed to measure the success of all kids. So we're still kind of on this equality. And I say measure the metrics of all kids' brilliance, I should say, right? Every kid is brilliant, is talented, skilled, but we don't always have the metrics. And so this cartoon is always a good one to remind us, right, about the fish, right? And the fish will, you keep asking it to climb a tree, it's going to live its whole life believing it's stupid because it's like, I can't climb that tree. And it's not because the fish isn't brilliant. It's just our metrics for its brilliance doesn't show up in that metric. Right. And so that's where we have to re-envision how do we measure student success through our metrics. And I'm going to show you an example in a second through a video. It's going to give you a sense of why, because some people will still not understand this. They'll say, well, everybody has an opportunity. Everybody has this. We got to work harder. You got to, have grit and all these kind of things. It's like, yeah, you know what? That sounds good. But, if the fish is like, hey, let me build a relationship with the monkey and jump on the monkey, pick me up and take me up the tree. Right. Like that's being resilient and creative, all that great stuff, right? But that's working really hard when sometimes our kids shouldn't have to, right? Because it's ingrained in the system that sometimes the metrics for success weren't designed to show the brilliance of all. And that's where we start to see kids who not only lack the agency to get up that tree, right? But then they also start to become very exhausted. And that's why you see generationally over and over, you see kids that don't do as well in the system. And it's not because they're not brilliant. Now, remember the history of public education. Okay, I'm not going to go through this with you tonight because this is a longer activity, but because we have new board members, I just want to remind you of the lesson that most of us as educators never got when we jumped into this body of water called public education, is we didn't really think about the history. Like, why do we have gaps in our system, right? That should be baffling you. That should be like keeping you up at night. Why in the heck is this the case? Right? And some of this is bigger than us. Some of this is you inherited a system that wasn't designed to be equitable. And so the history of public education, which should be, the link should be in your packet, but I just want to make sure you can see it here in case you want to just get a visual. So I shared a timeline with you, okay? And this visual is actually the online version now. And so this timeline starts in 1647 and it goes all the way to 2018. And so what you'll find in this is you do kind of your deeper research. What we talked about is the timeline in terms of the history. What was the purpose? Okay, what was its purpose? Back to the 1600s, it wasn't designed to serve all kids. It was actually for kids who were identified as European colonists, right? Who had land, who had wealth, and also who were being taught concepts of the Bible. So this was actually about literacy of biblical concepts. And so we have to remember the purpose of public education was not college and career ready through the wonderful curriculum you all have adopted, like Houghton Mifflin, Pearson, and all those great ones that y'all spend millions of dollars on. Okay, that was not public education at the time. As a matter of fact, this was more about elementary schools, right? This was not centered around serving kids or teaching kids who were poor. It was not centered around teaching children who were identified of color. what we call white at the time. So you got to do your history of whiteness as well, right? Because we're talking about European colonists, right? And the concept of whiteness really talked more about class, right? And there was discrimination even amongst Europeans here in this country, because remember, everyone who identifies European or white was not educated in the same way. If you were poor, you didn't get that education. Thomas Jefferson's quote, which often gives people kind of an emotional tug about breaking a few genius from the rubbish, right? And those 2-track system he proposed, is where it was opening up the door for poor students, right, to be able to have access. And again, we're still talking about males. We aren't talking about females at the time. We're not talking about indigenous people. We're not talking about enslaved people. We're just talking about wealthy land-owning males, right, from Europe in terms of colonists. And it's very important you recognize the foundation of our public education system was never designed to be equitable. And it actually wasn't designed to be equal. But the reason why we champion public education still is because there was evolution. You all should be excited. And as you go through your timeline, the evolution is that we did start to actually educate more kids. But for what? And this is where we got to think about, how does this impact our current landscape of our educational system, where you notice in the 1800s that we had a large influx of immigrants, primarily from Europe. And what you found is that now we had a different need in our society, because now we also had industries evolving. So we look to public education to create a docile, obedient workforce. And so now you fast forward 2021, do we have remnants of creating a docile, obedient workforce? We do. So this is why it's critical as a governance team that you go back and unpack the history of public education so that you understand the system you're trying to combat. Okay, this is a really important piece of our homework that we always have to do as governance teams, because policy is embedded all in this timeline. And policy is not just about federal government, state, but this is actually about local level policy, right? When we look at segregation, we look at all the different ways that inequities have shown up, and they still do today, and we don't even realize it. So without recognizing that, it's hard to interrupt. Okay, so that's what we talk about, knowing the history of public education as a governance team. Okay, so that was a recap, and I know our new members, what I'd suggest you do is just to take a look at that timeline on your own. I believe it's in your packet under, it's a link, so it's not the hard copy. Because the hard copy is like 32 pages, and I didn't want to make your packet so thick, and you'd say, oh, she expects us to read this. Yeah, she does, but not 32 pages like that. Like the timeline's much easier to look at in Zoom. Okay, so again, why do the gaps exist? Because we have a system that was not designed to support public education. So I'm going to share a quick video with you before we transition into our last piece. And this video is going to give you a depiction of why we recognize the equity gaps exist, but also it should make you be thinking about, okay, what is our role as a governance team to address these? Understanding the impact that several of our kids are experiencing today. Okay, this is today. Okay, so I want you to be making some connections. This video is called the Unequal Opportunity Race. And some of you, I know Dr. Wells has seen this with cabinet and with the leaders, but how many of you have seen this particular video, the Unequal Opportunity Race? So Sarah, yeah, okay, and Brian, got it. Melissa, yep. Okay, great. All right, so those of you that seen it, I want you to watch it again and see some of the things that you're picking up on that we may miss the first time. Okay, I see this video all the time because I show it all the time, right? But every time I watch it, I see something new that really resonates with me. So as you're watching it, I want you to be writing down 3 things. I want you to write down one thing that was confirmed for you. We call it our CAP moment. What was confirmed for you? Okay, what was confirmed? Now you're like, yes, I get it. That makes sense. The A is ask. Okay, what question do you want to ask? I want you to write that down. And then the last one, the P is provoke. What emotion was provoked in you? Okay, very important to process emotions when we're doing this type of work, because it's very emotional, because it's personal. All right, so the unequal opportunity race, about 4 minutes long. And so I'm going to reshare. Let me pull it up, make sure you all can see it okay. And I see Dr. Wells is like, let me stand up and stretch. It's a good time. Always when I'm watching videos, sometimes it's nice to stretch too. All right, let's see. All right, give me 1 second. All right, open up, Nicole. There you go. All right. All right, so there's music, but it's not any visual or verbal language, just music. All right, so as you watch the video, take a deep breath. Deep breath. There's a lot to unpack in that video. Lots of things probably were confirmed for you. Maybe some emotions that were provoked. And maybe lots of questions that may have come up for you. Okay, but as you're watching the video and you're thinking about your CAP moment, I just want you to pause and just take a moment to write. Okay, I call it this your silent reflection. Often as governance teams, we practice not responding, but just reflecting. Call it the silent pause, sacred pause, just to reflect. We process our role in addressing inequities. Just take a moment to write your CAP moment. Right. All right, so you're finishing your CAP moment. What we're going to do is make a pivot to what does all this mean for governance, right? Nicole, why did you spend so much time talking about equity and defining it, talking about the barriers and talking about the gaps? Like, why? What does this have to do with governance? Right now, hopefully you heard me make connections throughout, right? Throughout governance, 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 always in the lens of governance, but always through the lens of equity. So as you're thinking about this, one of the things that may have been confirmed for you as a governance team member is that the system was not designed to be equitable. So I think we all may have some confirmation about that, right? And as a matter of fact, the system wasn't even designed to be equal. So you saw that in the video, right? And some didn't get a head start. Some got to start much later and still trying to catch up on that race, right? And this system has been created hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So if we know the system wasn't designed to be equitable, then where do we go from here as a team? Okay, and that's where I want you to make a connection now and bridge it to governance, which over your next 2 study sessions, we're going to go deep and spend a lot more time on governance, a little bit less time on equity, but always tying equity to governance. Because here's the reality. If the system wasn't designed to be equitable, but now I'm a governance team trying to create equity, I got to be able to do that with strategy, right? I got to be able to do that with our core values, our beliefs. And we have to be able to do that in different ways that we have never done before. Okay, but it's not going to be driven by our emotions. It's not going to be driven by anything more than our strategy, our collective voices, and obviously understanding what equity is. So there was an article that was given to you that was placed in your packet. How many of you had a chance to read through your article? No judgments, no judgments. You don't get an F for that if you didn't. Okay, everybody got to read. Okay, Melissa's like a little bit. Yeah, that's all right. Melissa, you and Veronica, I'm gonna give y'all a pass just because it's like, remember, I don't give any D's or F's, right? I don't give any D's or F's, only incompletes, which means you got more time to make it up, right? But you got a lot to kind of catch up on in terms of the content. But this particular article, the reason I had you read it, for time, we're not gonna go deep into discussion, but I wanna make a connection to this. As a governance team, as you get ready to take a deeper dive as a team around doing governance with an equity lens, you're going to have to recognize that there's going to be some detours along the way, right? And when I say detours, what I mean is when Dr. Gorski unpacks some of the things that are happening in the system, right, in our schools, you may have heard some of these scenarios. You may be making connections to ways in which we're trying to fix kids, right? And in the name of equity, we actually create more inequities. We have a hard time naming things like racism. We have a hard time. We try to make it comfortable for our staff, right? When we start to talk about things, and then it's not really about kids anymore. I mean, he's all into the depth. And you should have lots of questions for Dr. Gorski because he goes there. But I want you to be thinking about, as a governance team, how with having more understanding about some of the detours, you will be able to get ahead of them so you can interrupt them when they show up at your boardroom, right? When they show up in Dr. Wells' office, right? When they show up in spaces where you are interrupting a system and pushing back on the concept of deficit thinking that sometimes us as educators have about our kids. When our families start to be more empowered with information and start to call us on things that show up in that article. They just don't have the voice yet, but it's happening. They just don't have that voice, right? They're in a system where it wasn't designed to hear my voice. So I don't even think I can come tell you, right? Even though I know that you believe in equity, but you're still going to have community members not quite ready. But when they do, we want to be prepared to embrace the truth. And the truth is their truth, right? But we also want to be prepared to push our leaders and our teachers in our classrooms, our classified staff, anyone that engages with kids on understanding our role in interrupting these inequities and not taking the detour when the work gets uncomfortable, because that's the essence of the article, right? The essence of the article. I want to, again, we're not going to go in a deep discussion for this one because just for time, I want to make sure that I can make another connection. But is there anyone that has a burning desire to share anything that just was like an aha moment for you for the article? I just want to just allow a quick moment to see if anyone has just anything that just was like, I got to share. All right, Clementina, go ahead. And then Sarah, no, I saw 2 hands. I'm sorry. Okay, Clementina, jump in.
Okay.
And then Brian, there you go.
Okay. On the board, I'm always so impatient. I want every change to be immediate. And the article confirms that that's okay. He says we cannot afford to wait. We cannot saunter. The time is now. And this is the perfect moment. The history recently, Black Lives Matter, the silver lining of COVID-19 pandemic. It is the time for us to really revisit education as we send kids back to school.
Got it. So true. Perfect timing to read this article, huh, Clementina? Very relevant. Yep. Powerful. Ryan, jump in.
Yeah, for me, I felt when the discussion was around like changing the narrative within the space where you are, where when you're talking about the racism that you see or the inequities that you see within the district or within the place where you are, that should be the norm, and that should be in, that everybody has within your organization. But in actuality, that person is usually singled out and pushed to the side and made to feel like the loner. But it should be the opposite.
Yeah.
And that really stood out for me.
Yeah.
I was waiting for the cheat code though, as I was reading through.
The cheat code, oh, that's funny. There, the cheat code is in the back of the article, right? Give some cheat code to that, but it's easier said than done, right? The article calls some things out, but the lived experience of many who feel isolated on this journey because they're calling things out, but it's not the shared belief of everyone. That's often a detour to the work too. So thank you for calling that out too. Yeah, Sarah, jump in.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So I liked the redistribution principle, and I think that is sometimes the hardest. Everyone, especially in the Bay Area, we're all, progressive. We support, everyone's got their Black Lives Matter signs in their windows, but it kind of goes right up until you actually have to give something up. I think that's, the hard part as a governance team is sometimes to actually make some change. It means that some people are gonna be worse off, and that there's not always community willingness to do that. And some of the discussions over the many years I've been in the district around how many AP classes are we gonna have, and we can't do anything about our math curriculum because we need to have whatever, that I won't restate all the reasons we've all sat through those same kinds of conversations, but that part just
good.
I appreciate, that it does require some redistribution, and you can't just say I'm going to change everything, but I'm going to do it without upsetting the existing benefits that some people are getting.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you, Sarah, for that. That was a big one, right? I mean, it's huge. And I just appreciate you seeing it, like the journey you've been on throughout the years, right? Like the article is so relevant to now, but like you've made that connection to that struggle throughout the years of how to help people see it differently, because someone will feel like there's a loss or something's getting taken away. And as a governance team, this is going to be one of the things you're going to struggle with, because people are going to push back. Right. So having that context of that redistribution principle of let's shift our resources to kids who need it the most, but also help people understand they're not losing anything, but that we're really kind of leveling the playing field, equally high outcomes for all. Right. So nobody's losing. Right. But we have to help people understand it. And that's why we go back to having common language. And this is a long process. It's just not that easy to make that decision. And Sarah, you've seen that, right? We had some decisions we had to make and they weren't always easy. And this is part of why they're not easy, because everyone doesn't always understand just yet. I love the connections y'all are making. Our students, I think I saw y'all wave. So I think you all had a chance to take a look at it. Was there anything that just stuck out to you as a student when you read that particular article? Just want to make sure we give a chance to hear your voices before we do our kind of final closing thoughts about governance.
You want to go, Audrey? I can go.
Sure. I picked out one thing in particular was the like first, I think as you called it, like the to-dos or the fixes
Uh-huh.
or something,
Yep, the
which
principles.
is direct
Mhm.
confrontation, the direct confrontation principle.
Mm.
So I think we see a lot of kind of, I mean, the whole article talks about this, the kind of like
Yeah,
curving around
interesting.
things. And I've definitely experienced that as, and going off of what President Hinckley was saying, was doing them only up until a certain spot. So I think that principle definitely like identified that directly for me.
Good, good, good. That's a powerful one. I appreciate that. Direct confrontation. Big. Leo, jump in.
Yeah, something that stood out to me was I think it was it equity? Number equity detour number 4 was the celebrating diversity detour.
Yeah.
And it sort of reminded me of how a lot of the time people try and sort of like indirectly address an issue or the issue of racism, where they won't really get out the root of the problem, and they'll focus on a symptom of racism rather than the power structures itself. And that just stood out to me a lot because it's very I think it really like calls out the fact that while addressing symptoms at night is nice, it's not effective and not really sustainable.
There it is. Yeah, thank you, Leo. That's powerful. Yeah, that one, I'm sure, Leo, I don't know if you could like envision that actual detour at school, right? Like we've seen like examples of that particular detour play out with celebrating diversity, right? But we're still kind of missing like the real essence of what that diversity is. The isolation of kids or the celebration of Heritage Month, right? And cool, like Black History Month assembly, or we put up things on the wall for the month, or it's all these different ways, but we're still kind of missing the deep seated issues. And so I just appreciate you calling that out too. Powerful. So you see, this particular article can get you fired up, and I've literally done hours of just talking about this article in itself. And the reason I give it to you as a governance team, because as you deepen your work together, you have to be comfortable to unpack these discussions together. This is why we call them study sessions, right? We're just getting to know the content. We have to feel comfortable having the discussion. You're not making any decisions tonight, right? You're just giving more context. You're being more aware so that you can get comfortable with talking about the things that are uncomfortable. Right. And so this article really calls some things out. Dr. Gorski calls a lot, but also you should have questions. If he was here to talk about his article, you should have some questions that came up for you too. Like, well, what do you mean by that? Right. Because there's some real interesting concepts. So I want to do this. As you get ready, as President Hinckley said, turn into pumpkins pretty soon. I want to make some connections to why we're talking about this context of equity with a governance team. Okay. And where we're going. I want you to see where we're going, because we're going to continue to build our content and understand equity, but we also got business. We got board business, right? We got decisions we have to make. We have some real collective work we have to do. So I'm going to share with you what that looks like moving forward. Okay. And again, don't try to memorize all this tonight. Remember, this is all just kind of an overview. And what we'll do is in our next study session, go deep into each of these topics and be able to really spend some more time. And then after Nicole Anderson kind of disappears from the study session scene, in between, you all are going to be encouraged to continue this work. Okay, this is the work you have to do. And so this is what I want you to think about in our next sessions coming up, because we have 2 actually in April and May. So one is your board governance assessment. So you all got a chance to look at this one, right? And I showed this to you the first session back in May. Since you have new members, you have lots that's happened since COVID showed up. It's always good to, and I mentioned earlier about recentering your work. Okay, recentering also is about putting up the mirror and saying, are we an effective team? Okay, are we an effective team to lead for equity? You cannot lead for equity in education without having effective governance practices. Okay, and so you all, I believe, if I did my own assessment of like Albany Unified's governance team, I think you are a phenomenal team. I've gotten to spend several years with you to really see some amazing work. But you'll also know that we're still on our journey, right? We still have work to do, and there's specific things we got to work on. Well, what are those? Well, what you see in the assessment is centered around research, 8 characteristics of effective boards. Okay, there's an actual whole report if you want to really look at the research through the Center of Public Education, where it gives examples of boards and some of those key things that board members do collectively and individually to be effective, because without that foundation, you can't lead for equity. It just doesn't work. It doesn't sustain itself. I think Leo mentioned about sustainability. It does not sustain itself. It won't last. Okay, so this board assessment calls out shared vision, right? And so this is something we got to think about. And so in your next study session, April 27th, I'm going to ask you to do this as part of your homework, is I want you to go deeper into where are we in our 8 characteristics as an effective team. Okay, so shared vision, strong belief systems, shared, okay, collective, like remember I talked about the elephant and blind men come together, and we actually are looking at common language, right? Common vision. Collaboration, collaborative relationship with the superintendent, with your staff, your community. Okay, that's a hint of effective governance. Always focus on equity. Accountability driven, spending less time on operational stuff and more time on focusing on equity and policies. This is code for let our superintendent do his job. Let the staff do their job. And I'm laughing and being sarcastic, but I kid you not, when you go deep into equity work, it starts to get messy and we start to get out of our lane in terms of who does the work and who's the visionary for the work, right? So that's why it's really important to have a real clear culture about how we look at our roles in terms of holding ourselves accountable, not for all the operational stuff in the weeds, right? That's why you hire a superintendent, why he has staff, but really about how do we focus on policy at that 30,000 foot level. That's the role of a board, right? So that's something we work on, right? That's a struggle for most boards, right? It's continuously recognizing our roles, but we have to have that in place in order to create equitable governance. Being data savvy, I mentioned that earlier, so I'm not going to go deep in that tonight, but we're going to talk about data. How do you actually be data savvy and use that to drive your work, even the data that's negative, right? You got to make sure we understand how to use that to move our work towards continuously closing gaps. Your resources, you have to be fiscally sound, so you know that your resources are going to be something that you're going to have to think about. How do we talk about, Sarah, you mentioned redistribution principle. As a board, we're going to have to look at how do we redistribute resources based on who has the most need. And that's going to be important. As a collective board, you understand how to monitor and measure the work you're doing, okay, based on the resource, because you got to be fiscally sound also to do that. The last two are kind of together. You lead as a united team. Remember, I mentioned the 5 fingers in superintendent, right? Like it's a board, right? You got your 2 student members. So all together, we're all individuals, but we come together as a team, united. And so this is where we're going to talk about when you all vote on things, right? How your decision-making process goes. We don't all have to agree. We all have the right to have individual decisions that we make in terms of even how we vote. But once that vote is over, what does it look like after? That's where united decisions happen, right? And that's a work in progress for most boards, right? So we talk about that piece. And of course, taking time to learn together. Hence tonight, study session, we're learning together, right? We have to always be in a space of learning. You don't always want to be in a regular board meeting trying to figure all this out. That's not a good practice, right? Think about how you felt last night. Was your brain in a place to start learning a bunch of stuff about equity? Probably not, right? You're in business mode at regular meetings. That's why we always carve out time for study sessions. And effective boards carve out time to learn together, okay? Going to the CSBA conferences, going to the MIG trainings, all of those things are things that we do to create our learning together. Now, the 3 things I'm going to help you all out with in terms of being able to check off the box, okay, is having an equity statement. So I've talked a lot about that. You're going to have a statement. That's what effective boards have, is our common vision around what does equity mean. Second thing is having an equity policy. So we're going to make sure that when this is all said and done, you have a really great equity policy that you use to govern your work. And then the third thing is having a plan, right? It's not enough to have the vision. You got to have, how are we going to do this? And this is where Dr. Wells gets direction from you, and you leverage things like the Student Achievement Task Force, who actually is giving recommendations, right, about what the plan should include that aligns directly with your LCAP. Okay, so this assessment, there's a lot to unpack in this, and this is kind of the core of what we'll do the remaining sessions to really talk about how do we have effective practices so we can actually see this equity work happen. Okay, so that's where we're going in our next sessions. The rest of the slides are going to be part of your next slide deck, so I'm not going to go deep, but just that visual about our roles. This is always important. Okay, notice that dotted line, who's above the line, who's below the line, but notice it's dotted, because ultimately you're going to come together, right? and have a united culture on how we govern. Board adopts policy, evaluates, asks the questions, right? Superintendent and staff get the job done, report back, make sure we implement the vision, monitor what's going on in our schools. Okay, it's hard work, but if this is not in place, equity work will not happen. Okay. So as we think about our next steps moving forward, I'm going to walk you through things like prioritizing your work. Okay, I'm going to walk you through those. So that looks like this type of document. So we're going to go through how do we get the board to narrow its focus and not try to do everything, right? All things equity. We want to start to narrow focus into 4 areas. So I'm going to walk you through how to prioritize your work so that everything you do, the questions you ask, everything you do around your work as a governance team is focused and funneled into like 4 buckets, I call it. So we're going to walk through that. And I think you're going to appreciate that and help you just to focus a little bit more because you're trying to do a lot. And so I want to make sure that you can stay really focused on what the things are that the board should do and what are the things superintendent should do so that you can really stay laser focused. Okay. So our official next steps, I want to just continue to encourage you to leverage your student achievement task force. I believe they gave you a presentation. Was that last week? I believe last week, if I'm looking at my calendar right. Yep. So remember, is it last week? Yeah. So leverage your task force. I'm sharing this slide with you because part of what I had the pleasure of doing is meeting with that original kind of thought partnering group. And this is the work that continuously I work with task force to help them kind of flesh out how they operate. So I'm going to share this with you. And for the folks who are on the task force, I know Clementina and Brian, obviously we've gotten a chance to tag team on that. So we're going to continue to, offer any support you need on that to evolve that work, to support the board and kind of the vision of implementing the closure of equity gaps. Definitely, I always encourage you using that opportunity. Okay. And so I will see you again on April 27th and May 27th. And so these particular study sessions are going to go deeper into the things that I showed in the latter part of our session. So we're going to have a lot more time for governance. But I think you kind of see where I'm going with. We got to have our equity vision solid if we're going to actually do governance in a space that is honestly going to be sustainable. And so that's why it's so important to understand. So our equity statement, we're going to keep evolving that. Okay, we're going to have an equity policy and we're going to develop a plan through focusing on our priorities. Okay, so we got a lot of work to do. But in 2 hours, your brain should be fried. And you should feel like, oh my God, I don't even know where to start. So I'm going to leave you with one notation of where to start the work. Okay. And remember, our email addresses are here. I want to make sure I share. Dr. Dan also is my partner in crime, one of my great associates on our team who's also gotten a chance to work with your leadership team too. So reach out anytime in between if you need a thought partner. Some of you have been really great about that. No, I'm always here to support in between the sessions. Okay. Extend that, Veronica. As well as Melissa, anytime, please reach out. Okay, that's what we're here for. Sometimes you can't do all of this in a collective group because the Brown Act and just the experience of being kind of in the public, sometimes having that coaching or support, thought partnering, resources is always available. So please know I extend that to each of you, including our student trustees as well. Okay, but I want to just say this in closing, that you are at a moment in time where you have a lot to do as a governance team. Continue to be effective and great at what you're doing. Okay. You're doing a great job despite what sometimes public opinion might differ, right? You get a couple folks who ain't happy with you, but congratulations. Every board in America has a fan club that don't like them right now. And I'm not trying to downplay any of your community members who feel ultimately they love their kids. That's all they're saying. I love my babies and I want what's best. How it comes out doesn't always land right. But your role as a governance team is to absolutely ensure that every single kid, every one of them, is educated in an equitable manner. And you have the opportunity of a lifetime to do things differently. And I'm excited for you. So with that, if you're wondering what to do next, I want to say, don't try to pass a new policy. Don't try to do too much with regards to equity. Just continue to work on self, work on where does my role in this individually? What is our role as a collective team? And let's continue to be inwardly reflecting on who we are as a team so that when we come out into public, right, we are a united force behind equity work as a governance team. That's the crux of this work. And you don't have to rush that, right? You're on a great pace. You're doing that work. And so I just want to appreciate each and every one of you, just appreciate the time tonight. I know you're exhausted. And President Hinckley, I said 9:10, and guess what time it is? It is 9:10. And so you are not officially pumpkins yet, but I want to pass the virtual mic back over to you and see if there's any questions or any comments, obviously to close out before I jump off, but just want to hear from you all, anything, questions or anything of that nature before we jump off.
Yeah, I'll let folks ask. I will say I could probably listen to you for, 2-3 more hours, but I'm not going to do that to anybody. I just want to thank you for, as always, your energy and focus and feeling like, it never feels tiring, but we do need to, get our sleep.
Yes.
But I just wanted to really appreciate, the way that you approach all this work, and looking forward to the next session. So I'll let folks make comments if they'd like. Go ahead, Brian.
Appreciate you, President Hinckley.
Yeah, I mean, I have set in on your presentations at the conferences, in person. They have each time, been life-changing. So, I always appreciate that, and I appreciate the session this evening. I'm with our president there. I could sit in this for another hour or two and be just fine. But I I have one comment, and then I actually have a question that I'm hoping we can talk about maybe in our next session.
Okay.
My comment was just that I wanted to take a moment to thank everybody for coming tonight and for being willing to go on this journey. I especially wanted to thank the student board members, because on top of their regular homework and their regular assignments, they also did this and read the article and pointed to so I mean that's just a lot. And so the props to them for that. And so my question is around governance versus management, and I'm just hoping that we could really dive into that, because that's a really, I'll speak for myself, that's a blurred line. That could be really tough sometimes. And so I'm hoping that we can just really kind of dive into that in a lot of detail in our future.
Absolutely. Yeah, you remember that clock picture that I showed with the yellow background and that clock, the dotted line? That's the image and the slide that we gonna go deep into, because that's where we talk about like our roles is really what it is. Like, what do we do in terms of managing? And then what do we do in terms of monitoring and having that vision? Like it is a blurred line, because we're people and we all have a different culture. So what your board does may look different from the next board, right? You got to have a culture, but you also have to have some protocols and norms that are very clear about our roles, because that can get sticky. Because I think, Brian, I'm gonna call you on the word you used was passion, right? Passion can sometimes equal emotion, and sometimes can equal energy, and put it in spaces where we cross that line, right? And we go into different lanes. That happens, very normal and natural, because this is heart work, right? This is people work. But we do have to recognize our roles so we can be effective. So we definitely will unpack that. It's a big part of this. So absolutely. Yep.
I just want to give kudos to you too, Nicole. I'm really old, but I still learn so much from you. So I just want to thank you so much.
And feeling is mutual. I learned quite a bit and respect your experience as an educator, and know that this has been a passion, right? Go back to that word passion, right? For many years, right? And I'm just excited to lock arms with you, because this work is always important and never ends. So thank you, appreciate it, and much respect to you as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Nicole. And we will see you in some number of weeks. Can't remember, but we will. You should feel free to send us homework, in advance of that meeting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Board assessment is it. Your board assessment, go through it, do your own assessment. And if you didn't get a chance to read through the articles, right, not just the racial equity detours, but also the water system change, that one as well, because they all kind of tie together with where we're going with the work. So if you didn't get a chance to read those, that would be the other homework, is just to catch up is all. So no biggie. Great. I know y'all busy people, and just appreciate each of you in your engagement. So absolutely.
Great. Thank you so much. Looking forward to seeing you soon.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you to the
Great.
staff. I forgot to say
Yeah.
thank you to the staff. They hung in there tonight. I know they're exhausted, and Dr. Wells, you should be proud. You got a great team holding it down with you. So thank you so much, all of you, for hanging in there tonight.
Great. Well, we are adjourned, and I'll see
Right.
everyone on Tuesday.
All right.
Thanks, Nicole.
Thank you.